Hey guys, welcome to day 33 of the Lenten Devotional. So the passage that we are looking at today is Philippians chapter 2. So in this chapter, we see how Paul is pouring out to the people of Philippi, and he continues to address our duties as Christians and how we should in some ways imitate Christ in how he was and be an example of Christ. So looking at verses 1 to 11, Apostle Paul focuses on two main qualities of Christ through these verses, which are Christ's humility and his love for everyone. Paul states in verse 2 how we should be like-minded and show the same love that Christ did. And Paul says how in humility you should value others more than yourselves, and that you should put others' interests above your own interests. And so by being like-minded to Christ, we as Christians should all mutually love each other. And so verse 3 tells us that we shouldn't put our own selfish ambitions and interests over others, and especially our love for each other. There's no greater enemy to Christians' love than pride. And ultimately, a selfish thought and an act out of pride is what destroys the love between us Christians. It is easy for pride to take over and us to act out of pride. We shouldn't consider ourselves better than anyone else, and we should love each other and overlook our imperfections and not be easy to judge one another, but to love each other for who we are. And so moving on to verse 7, it really emphasizes how Jesus was humble and how he humbled himself in the appearance of man. And Jesus' humbleness displayed his obedience. And Paul encourages us to be humble in obedience to Christ, and that we should follow this example of Christ. So when looking at verses 12 to 18, Paul talks about how Christians should live looking at how much Christ is willing to do for us. And Paul expects the people of Philippi and even us as Christians and followers of Jesus to be obedient. And so verses 12 and 13 stood out to me because Paul says to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you and to will and to act in order to fulfill his purpose. And so in these verses, Paul says how the people of Philippi need to wholeheartedly put their effort into their Christian lives and live in the way where they are scared of failing to live in that way. And so Paul gives us the ultimate reason why Christians should be able to fulfill the Christian life wholeheartedly, and it's all because of God's work in us. And finally, in verses 19 to 30, Paul talks about Timothy and Epaphroditus. Paul starts by talking about Timothy and how Paul knows no one who is like-minded as Timothy, who genuinely puts other interests over his own. And Timothy has served with Paul in the work of the gospel. And Paul says how Timothy is a compassionate servant who truly loves and cares about the church. And in verse 20 and 21, when Paul says that Timothy is concerned for your interests and the interest of Christ. And so when reading that, I felt like Paul was saying that to serve Christ, it also involves serving others. And that definitely comes from the love that we have for each other. And so Paul says that he doesn't want to send Timothy, but instead he wants to send his brother and his fellow soldier, Epaphroditus. And so Epaphroditus helped Paul during his time of need. And Paul ends off by saying how Epaphroditus was ill and almost died for the work of Christ. And overall, after reading Philippians 2, some points we should take from this passage include how we should love one another for all who we are, and we should be humble towards each other and be an example of Christ. I hope you guys have an amazing Thursday.